everyone. I hope you're doing well. The last time we just finished part 2 of chapter 3 of Serafina and the Black Cloak. We had 2 questions that we wanted to look over. First question was, what do you think is the relationship between Mr. Thorn and Mr. Bindle? If you look in your book, if you look on page 36, it says in the second paragraph that Mr. Bindle and Mr. Thorn were companions, but it was equally clear that Mr. Bindle had serious doubts as to whether his friend could actually play. If you look at the conversation between the 2 men, I think that they are friends. That's what companions are, so they get along well. I think that maybe Mr. Bindle likes to aggravate Mr. Thorn in some ways because he is giving him a hard time about being able to play the violin, and he's making people laugh around him. And then if you continue on page 37, Mr. Bindle does say, "You never cease to amaze me, Thorn. You shoot like a marksman, you speak fluent Russian, and you play the violin like the Lottie." So I think that he really is impressed by his friend. Maybe he's encouraging him in some ways. I hope that that relationship stays positive throughout our story, but I'm not sure. So we'll have to see how that relationship grows. And then the second question was, how does Serafina feel about the boy who found her? It doesn't really tell us exactly how she feels, but it does tell us, that she was in shock. It says startled. So when you're startled, something is it jumps out at you and it's kind of scary. So startled, Serafina whirled around and started to hiss, but then she stopped herself. And then it explains the boy, and he was asking her if she was lost, and she wasn't sure what the boy thought about her, but she also wasn't sure about him either. So we're going to go ahead and we are going to read the rest of chapter 3. If you will be on page 38, and I'm starting at the second paragraph. It kind of looks like a third paragraph, but we're starting right here as it says, "Are you lost?" Okay. "Are you lost?" the boy asked again, but this time she heard what sounded strangely like kindness in his voice. "May I help you find your way?" He wasn't timid or shy, but he wasn't overconfident or arrogant either. And it surprised her that he didn't seem angry at her for being there. There was a trace of curiosity in his tone. I'm not lost," she scampered out. It's all right," he said as he stepped towards her. "I still get lost sometimes, and I've lived here for 2 years. Serafina sucked in a breath. Suddenly, she realized that she was speaking face to face with the young master, Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew. She had seen him many times before, standing at his bedroom window looking out at the mountains, or galloping his horse across the grounds, or walking alone on the footpath with his dog. She'd watched him for years, but she had never been this close to him. Most of what she knew about him she had overheard from the gossiping servants, and when it came to the youngest master, they sure did prattle on. When he was 10 years old, his family died in a fire, and he became an orphan. His uncle took him in, and he became like a son to the Vanderbilts. He was known as a loner. Some of the less charitable folk whispered that the young master preferred the company of his dog and his horse to most people. She'd overheard the men in the stables saying that he'd won many blue ribbons at an equestrian events, and he was considered one of the most talented horseback riders around. The cooks, who prided themselves on preparing the most exquisite gourmet meals, complained that he always shared the food on his plate with his dog. "I've explored pretty much every room on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors," the young master said to her. "And the stables, of course, but the other parts of the house are like a foreign land to me." As the boy spoke, she could tell that he was trying to be polite, but his eyes kept studying her. It was nerve-wracking. After all those years she had been hiding, it felt so strange to have someone actually looking at her. It made her stomach twist, but at the same time, her skin tingled all over. She knew she must look completely ridiculous standing before him in the remnants of her pa's old work shirt. He must have noticed her hands were dirty. There were smudges all over her face. Her hair was as wild as a banshee's, and there was no hiding its streaky color. How could he help but stare? She'd reckon he knew most of the guests and servants, and she could see him trying to figure out who she was. How out of place she must seem to him. She had 2 arms and legs like everyone else, but with her sharp cheekbones and her golden eyes, she knew she didn't look like a normal girl. No matter how much she ate, she couldn't put any weight on her feral leanness of her body. She wasn't sure she looked more like a skinny little shoat to the Vanderbilt boy or like a savage little weasel, but neither of those animals belonged in the house. There was a part of her, maybe the smart part, that wanted to turn tail and run, but she thought that maybe the young master might be the perfect person to tell all about the girl in the yellow dress. The silky laced adults with their highfalutin airs wouldn't pay a smudge-faced girl any mind, but maybe he would. "I'm Braden," he said. "I'm Serafina," she blurted out before she could help herself. "You fool! Why did you give him your name?" It was bad enough that she had allowed herself to be seen, but now he had a name to go with her face. Her father is going to kill her. "Meet you, Serafina," he said, bowing as if she deserved the same respect as a proper lady. "This is my friend Gideon," he said, introducing her to his dog, who continued to sit and study her malevolently with steady black eyes. "Hello," she managed to say, but she didn't appreciate the way the dog stared at her like it was only his master's command that kept him from chomping on her with his gleaming white teeth. Gathering her courage, she looked at Braden Vanderbilt nervously. "Master Braden, I came up here to tell you something that I saw." "Really? What did you see?" he asked, full of curiosity. "There was a girl, a pretty blonde girl in a yellow dress, down in the basement last night, and I saw a man in as the coterie of ladies and gentlemen began to float out of the tapestry gallery and move towards the main doors, the handsome Mr. Thorne broke away and approached Braden, interrupting her. Are you coming, young Master Vanderbilt?" he asked encouragingly in his southern accent. "Our horses are ready, and I'm anxious to see your latest riding skill. Perhaps we can ride together." Braden's face lit up with a smile. "Yes, sir, Mr. Thorne," he called. "I'd like that very much." As soon as Mr. Thorne rejoined the others, the youngest master's eyes immediately returned to Serafina. "Excuse me, you were telling me what you saw?" At that moment, Mr. Bozeman, the estate superintendent of her pa's boss, came stomping up the stairs. He'd always been a scowling-faced curmudgeon, and today was no exception. "You there, who are you?" he demanded, clutching Serafina's arm so hard that she winced. "What's your name, girl?" Just when she thought that it couldn't get any worse, a sudden commotion rose up the main hall. A devilish, overweight, middle-aged woman, still wearing her nightclothes, came rushing down the grand staircase from the 3rd floor. She crashed into a crowd of flurry of hysterical panic. "It's Mr. Brams," Mr. Bozeman said, turning towards the disturbance. "Has anyone seen my Clara?" Mrs. Brams cried frantically, reaching out and grabbing the people around her. "Please help me. She's gone, missing. I can't find her anywhere." Mrs. Vanderbilt moved forward and took the woman's hand in an attempt to calm her. "It's a very large house, Miss Brams. I'm sure Clara is just off exploring." Worried discussion spread through the crowd. All the ladies and gentlemen of the riding party began talking to one another in confusion, wondering what was happening. Miss Clara Brams, Serafina thought. That's the girl in the yellow dress. This whole time, Mr. Bozeman kept his hand clamped on her arm. She wanted to leap forward and tell everyone what she'd seen, but then what would happen? "Where did you come from?" they demanded. "What were you doing in the basement in the middle of the night?" There'd be all sorts of questions that she couldn't answer. All of a sudden, Mr. George Vanderbilt, the master of the house, walked into the center of the crowd and raised his hands. Everyone, "May I please have your attention?" he said. All of the guests and servants immediately stopped talking and listened. "I'm sure that you all can agree that we need to delay our ride and search for Mrs. Brams. Once we find her, we'll resume our activities of the day." George Vanderbilt had a slender, dark-haired, intelligent-looking gentleman in his 30s with thick black mustache and keen, dark, penetrating eyes. He was well known for his love of reading, but he was a fit and healthy-looking man, too, who seemed far younger than his years. And Serafina wasn't the only one who thought so. She had heard servants in the kitchen joke that their master must have secretly discovered the fountain of youth. Mr. Vanderbilt was a meticulous dresser, and he admired his commanding presence. She couldn't help but notice his clothes, too, in particular his shoes, like the other gentlemen present. He wore a gentleman's riding jacket, but instead of riding boots, he wore expensive black patent leather shoes and strode across the hard surface of the marble floor. His shoes made familiar clicking sound, the same sound that she had heard in the corridors of the basement the night before. She looked at the other men's shoes. Braden, Mr. Thorne, and Mr. Bindles wore riding boots in preparation for their outing, but Mr. Vanderbilt was wearing his dress shoes. He approached the lost girl's mother and consoled her. "We're going to search this place from top to bottom, Mrs. Brams, and we'll keep looking until we find her." He returned to the ladies and gentlemen and waved over the footmen and the maidservants as well. "We'll break up into 5 separate search parties," he explained. "We'll search the entire house, all 4 floors, and all basements. If anyone finds anything suspicious, report it immediately." Mr. Vanderbilt's words struck fear into Serafina's heart. They were going to search the basement. The basement? That meant the workshop. With a mighty twist of her body, she yanked herself out from Mr. Bozeman's grip and darted away before he could stop her. She bounded headlong down the stairs into the basement. She had to warn her pa. The leftovers from last night's dinner, the mattress she slept on, they had to hide it all. All right, that's the end of chapter 3. Thank you for listening.